Hi, I see lots of people here who are new. Welcome. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We're going to record the first portion of this. So just to let you know that, and then we won't record if there's time for question and answers. I'll need to keep this to a solid 30 minutes, and there's quite a bit of time. There's quite a bit of updates today. So my name is Reverend Dr. Elise Cannon, the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. Today is day 468 since October 7th of 2023. It's January 16th, 2025. And I'm sure all of you are here because of the announcement of a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. And so that's what we'll be talking about primarily. We've been doing these weekly updates for the past 15 months. I do daily updates. I try to keep them to 10 minutes or less. I'm not very good at that. I'll try to keep this to about 20 to 25 minutes to leave 5 minutes for questions. So a ceasefire deal has been announced. We first heard about this from President-elect Trump. He made the announcement online on his, whatever the equivalent of X is. I'm afraid I don't know the name of it. I think he made that announcement on Monday, or maybe even before, but on Monday the 13th, the White House was saying that they could get the deal done between Israel and Hamas this week. On Tuesday, the language continued to be positive that they were finalizing the remaining deal. Then we heard the news from Axios that the leader of Hamas in Gaza, who happens to be, his name is Mohammed Sinwar. He's the brother of Yahya Sinwar, who was considered the mastermind of the October 7th attacks. He was killed by Israel last year. Mohammed Sinwar had reportedly agreed to a Gaza ceasefire deal. It's believed Mohammed Sinwar now controls the military wing of Hamas and is the top leader of Hamas in Gaza, the most senior leader. By Tuesday, it was widely reported that both Israel and Hamas had agreed to the broad framework, but that the details were, still being worked out. And I feel like we've heard this kind of, at least a half a dozen times, if not more. Negotiations were continuing in Doha. And then on Wednesday, we heard, oh my goodness, the deal is done. Israel and Hamas have agreed. At that point, the issue was maps, that Israel had yet to submit maps about the withdrawal of Israel from different parts of the Gaza Strip. This still continues to be a contentious issue. What we're hearing is that Israel has agreed to withdraw from populated centers of the Gaza Strip. Now, the vast majority of the people of Gaza have been displaced not once, not twice, but multiple times, some 7 or 8 or 10 or more times. You'll recall after the October 7th attacks, Netanyahu had said, the more than initially it was 1.4 million people had to be displaced from the north. So this issue of, where will Israel withdraw from is a huge contentious issue and could be a problem in terms of phase 2 of the deal. So I'll talk about these different phases, but I just wanted to put a pin in that because that could be a problem later on. Then we heard that another Hamas official, Itzhak al-Rishek, said that the deal was reached. He made that announcement coming out of the Qatari capital in Doha. He said it met all the Palestinian group's conditions, and it included a full withdrawal of Israeli forces, the return of displaced people to their homes, including North Gaza, and a permanent end to the war. Now, we're not there yet. That's not what the deal is. Then Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, thanked Joe Biden, President-elect Trump, and all of this was prior to the deal being announced. So here we are, Thursday morning. When I prepared this around midnight last night, East Coast time, the world was announcing that there was a deal. But the deal had to be approved by an 11-member cabinet in Israel and then 34 ministers of the coalition government. I checked the news maybe an hour ago in Israel, and as of then, the cabinet had said they would not meet to approve the deal because there was an issue, a technical issue related to a last-minute crisis. Now, Netanyahu is saying that's not going to hold up the deal, but that's where things stand. So the deal's not done. I mean, everybody's announcing there's a deal. It's been agreed to. It's true. I hope it moves forward. We're praying it moves forward. But that's where things stand, or at least that's where they stood as of an hour ago. A senior Hamas leader said this morning that the group is still committed to the ceasefire. Israel is saying that this last-minute crisis is because Hamas threw a wrench in the deal. It could be that wrench is that Hamas wanted to add one or two names of different leaders of Hamas to be released from Israeli prisons. I don't know that for a fact. So let's talk about what the deal is. Biden announced the deal, and he made it sound like it was the Biden deal, this three-part deal that Biden had presented, a few months ago. So he called it a three-part deal. Others are calling it a two-part deal. How many phases it is. There's two primary parts. I'll go through the three phases that Biden initially talked about, and then I'll talk about some of the specifics. The first phase is essentially 6 weeks. Biden said it includes a full and complete ceasefire. We'll see. That Israel would withdraw from all populated areas of Gaza. Again, we don't know what that means. Right now, the vast majority of the population of Gaza are in, very, very few areas. They're in humanitarian zones. They've been displaced so many times. They're in tent cities. The vast majority are in South Gaza. So the devil's in the details of what those maps look like. Hamas would release a number of hostages. I'll get into the specifics of that in a minute. I'm just telling you what President Biden said. Biden said American hostages would be released, and he was not specific about what that meant. I'll tell you that what I've read is 2 of the 3 American hostages that would remain would be released in phase 1. One of them's a soldier, so he would not be released. In the exchange, Israel would release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. I'll talk about those details in a minute. Then Biden said there would be a surge of humanitarian assistance. Well, a surge compared to nothing, fine. But honestly, the humanitarian assistance that's being assured would only be the amount of humanitarian assistance maybe at the levels that were pre the Gaza war. Phase 2, this has not really been agreed upon. And this is where this is so problematic. If the ceasefire holds, the whole first phase would be negotiating what happens in phase 2. It would be the remaining living hostages, including the male soldiers. It would be any remaining Israeli troops in Gaza would withdraw, which Israel has never agreed to this point, you need to know. And then the temporary ceasefire would become a permanent ceasefire. And phase 3 would then be the remains of the deceased hostages would be returned and a reconstruction plan would begin. So that's what Biden said. This morning around 8 a.m., as I mentioned, Netanyahu said there's problems with the deal. But Netanyahu has promised this last-minute crisis would not hold up the implementation. So let's talk about the details. The details are 42 days. There would be dozens of hostages, specifically 33 living hostages would be released over these 42 days in exchange for about 1,000 prisoners. Some of the prisoners would be released to Gaza. Some of the prisoners would be released to exile. That could be the wrench, is who gets to go back to Gaza and who, this is a very controversial issue. Who gets the right of return? And that's unresolved. That might be an issue that's resolved in phase 2. It's uncertain. 16 days after the agreement is signed, discussions on the second phase are set to begin. Now, I will tell you, a lot of the news I'm getting contradicts news from other sources. So depending on if you have a Hamas source, which I don't have directly, of course, but depending on if the source is an Israeli source or if the source is, they all are close to one another, but they often contradict one another. So if you are saying if you're listening to me and saying I'm contradicting myself, it's because I'm getting things from multiple sources. A U.S. official speaking on, conditions of anonymity said that 3 hostages would be released within 48 to 72 hours of the agreement. They said an unknown number of Palestinian prisoners would be held in Israel. Others that I heard news from said that there are specific numbers that are agreed to. Israeli news on Channel 13 Yesterday said after 6 weeks, or during the 6 weeks of cessation of fighting, there would be gradual withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor in the south and the Netzarim corridor in central Gaza. I find that hard to believe that the Netzarim corridor, it's one of the major security corridors. It's been expanded so extensively. I mean, that's just from all the news I've heard, but Israeli news reported that soldiers would leave Philadelphia and Netzarim, that there would be 600 aid trucks daily. That is higher than the numbers were just before the war, but just slightly. That Hamas would free 33 hostages, that Israel would free 30 prisoners for every civilian and 50 for every soldier. So 30 Palestinian prisoners for every hostage released, and then soldiers would not be released in the first phase. They would be released in later phases. The specific 33 hostages have been agreed to. They're what are considered humanitarian hostages. This includes women, children, men over 55, and those who are sick or ill or have an underlying health condition or were previously injured. Today, senior Israeli officials confirmed that Israel agreed to cede control of the Philadelphia corridor, but that would not happen until the completion of the 42-day first long phase. I'll summarize the hostage situation in terms of what we know about how many hostages are alive, who's remaining, etc. One of the Israeli journalists who's well known, Alon Ben David, said the Rafah crossing would start operating immediately upon the start of the deal, that was negotiated with Egypt. An Al Jazeera journalist, Tamar al-Mashah, said that there would be a 3-day preparatory phase where fighting would cease before phase 1 starts. That's not happened yet. There's not even 3 days before this is supposed to start, I don't think. If it starts today, there's 3 days, I guess. All this is supposed to begin on Sunday, but that could be delayed because, the war cabinet in Israel has not yet voted. So all this is supposed to begin on Sunday. The process would start with the release of female soldiers by Sunday. I said that there wouldn't be soldiers in the first phase. I'm sorry, I misspoke. So if there's 50 soldiers, 50 Palestinian prisoners released for soldiers, it could be 50-1 for those female soldiers who are supposed to be the first released starting on Sunday. As of yesterday, Wednesday, January 15th, Israeli forces continued their attacks across the Gaza Strip. This is really, really important to understand. While people have been celebrating the numbers of death tolls coming out of Gaza yesterday, when I started putting together this report, the number was 40 killed, then it was 50 killed, then it was 60 plus killed. By the time I reviewed this morning, there were more than 81 people killed since Wednesday morning and more than 200 people injured over the last 24 hours. And that is being widely reported across international news. One of the major concerns about the ceasefire deal is that so many of the details are vague. Patrick Kinsley, who I know well, who's the Jerusalem correspondent for the New York Times, he runs their office in Jerusalem. He said to persuade both sides to even get past this first phase, it had to be so vague and worded loosely with so many components unresolved, which means the chances of this collapsing are so high, which is one of the big concerns. How did this happen? It happened by a lot of international pressure. Steve Witkoff, who's President-elect Trump's Middle East envoy, pushed the Israeli delegation. There was a lot of strong arming, and it's said that in Doha, the Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani really pushed Hamas officials to finalize the agreement. The death toll in Gaza as of the last count was 46,788 people killed and more than 110,400 people wounded. Thousands are still missing. In the past week, a report was released that says that death toll could be 41% lower than the actual numbers. This was a research study that was released out of Britain from the Lancet Journal. It's an academic, peer-reviewed study from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It estimates that as of June of last year, the death toll was at 64,260. So it's saying that death toll is significantly understated. You'll recall the death toll on October 7th, 2023 in Israel was about 1,200 people killed. More than 240 people were taken hostage. I wanted to just summarize the hostage situation. According to Israel, it's believed there are 98 hostages still in Gaza. About 60 of them are alive. More than 100 were released in the week-long truce in November of 2023. Some have died in captivity. Some were rescued. There are 7 Americans still held captive in the enclave. Only 3 of the Americans are still believed to be held alive. 4 have been declared dead. 2 American hostages, it's been announced, will be released in this deal. Keith Siegel and Sagi Dekel Chen, they'll be a part of this first 33 captives. This was announced by a Biden official this week. Siegel is 65 years old. He'll be released because of his age. Dekel Chen was wounded on October 7th, so falls into the category of a health concern. The third American is Edin Alexander, who's an Israeli soldier and will not be released until the second phase of the deal. What's happened over the last 15 months? Of the 251 who were originally taken captive on October 7th, this was last updated on January 13th, 117 hostages have been freed or rescued. 78 of those were freed in the initial deal. 27 were foreign or dual nationals, which means that there were deals with other countries and Israel. So, I think that's significant to note. Israel rescued 8 hostages. Hamas militants released 4 women for humanitarian reasons. 74 hostages have been confirmed killed. Some of those by militants, many of those by Israeli airstrikes. 60 hostages are still believed to be alive. And I think it's important to remember the devastating toll, not only in terms of the death toll over the last 15 months, but just the havoc that has been wreaked across Gaza and other means. Almost all of the homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. 80% of commercial facilities have been affected. 88% of school buildings have been damaged or destroyed. 50% of hospitals are partially functional. 68% of road networks have been damaged or destroyed, and 68% of cropland has been damaged or destroyed. Israel has struck self-designated humanitarian zones more than 100 times just since May of last year. The number of journalists killed in Gaza stands at 203, and in the last day or two, an additional 3 journalists have been killed. So that's a summary of where things stand right now. I could go into extensive updates on how people have been responding to this deal. I think what's important to know in Israel is that there are members of Netanyahu's cabinet who significantly oppose the deal. The far-right ministers Ben-Gvir have called this deal a surrender by the state of Israel to Hamas. The far-right ministers have said that they would only support the phase 1 of the deal if in phase 2 of the deal there is continued bombing of Gaza. So that already tells you if the coalition in Israel stays in place, the long-term phase 3, if the coalition stays in place, there's little promise of all 3 phases being implemented. Now, if the coalition falls, the opposition of Netanyahu has said they support this deal, and the opposition has said they would join the coalition so that the Netanyahu coalition doesn't fall. But there's all kinds of dynamics in Israeli politics that would cause delays. That makes that it doesn't mean that it can't happen. It just means that there would be delays, etc. So opposition leaders, Lapid and Gantz, the former Israeli defense minister, welcomed the ceasefire deal. Palestinians in Gaza, in large part, have been celebrating, but there is such devastation in Gaza. There's just huge, huge, huge grief. And I haven't even talked about what's happened in the West Bank. West Bank in the occupied territories is being called the silent war. 6 people were killed in Jenin in the last couple of days. I could talk extensively about that. I could also talk about Trump saying that there will be hell to pay if all of the hostages are not released by his inauguration. All of the hostages will not be released by Monday, even with the implementation of this deal. So I think the comments about hell to pay from President Trump, I can save for next week. I've talked about those previously. You should know the Hezbollah-Israel ceasefire deal is hanging by a thread. Analysts have said that Israel has violated that ceasefire agreement numerous times weekly. And just this past week, in the last couple of days, Hezbollah fired rockets towards northern Israel. Israel has said that they would retaliate. All of this was buried completely because of the ceasefire news this week. Israel had an airstrike that killed 5 people in southern Lebanon last Friday. No Israelis were killed by the Hezbollah rockets that were fired, but that happened. There were elections in in Lebanon this week. Lebanon has a new president, Joseph Aoun, who is the new president of Lebanon. He is the army chief of Lebanon. He's backed by the United States. Lebanon also has a new prime minister. He is the former head of the International Court of Justice. His name is Nawaf Salam. So there is new political leadership in Lebanon. I can talk more about that later. There was an Israeli airstrike in the occupied West Bank that killed 3 Palestinians yesterday. The Associated News reported that there are some Israeli soldiers that are refusing to continue fighting in Gaza, saying that they saw or did things that crossed ethical lines, the Associated News reported yesterday. Israel is seeking to not rely on international weapons and is likely investing in domestic weapon production. That's one of the things that's been reported. The incoming Trump administration will be obliged to continue investigating Israel's potential violations of international humanitarian law through the use of U.S. weapons, a State Department spokesperson said yesterday as well. The Biden administration has been making final speeches, including Secretary Blinken. He made a very significant speech yesterday at the Atlantic Council, or maybe it was earlier this week. It's all becoming a blur. He said Israel should not annex the West Bank. I would encourage you to take a look at that speech. There has been rocket fire from Yemen, from the Houthis. Israel also bombed a power station and 2 ports in Yemen that killed at least 1 person. I think that was late last Friday. I won't give updates right now about Syria, but there's been a lot happening with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I think I'll skip the broader Middle East updates. And I think I will end the update there to leave 5 minutes for questions. So we'll stop the daily, weekly update recording now.